Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome back to the Daily Six. You know, in my line of work and what I do for you here on the Daily Six and teaching on Sundays, I do a tremendous amount of writing. And you know, whenever I sit down to begin a writing project, it always starts with an idea. And this got me thinking, something I've been reading this morning in Hebrews chapter 12, where it says that Jesus Christ is the author and the perfecter of our faith. He authors our faith and he perfects it, just like I try to perfect every word that I write for you guys and go back and edit it and look at it. Jesus Christ has been perfecting and shaping every precise bit of our faith and our journey. But I think more important than that, he is our author. I wonder if you'll come with me today and let's look together. We're going to start in Hebrews chapter 1 in the New Testament as we consider this great Old Testament narrative of how we know God. Hebrews chapter 1, get it open and come on with me. So what do you think it means for Jesus to be the author of our faith? Now, you might remember when we started this whole teaching series called Knowing God some 7 weeks ago or so, we spent all of our time that first week in the book of Hebrews, chapter 1, and some other places in the New Testament, which you might think is kind of odd. We're doing a study on the Old Testament, how to know God throughout the 45 different characters of the Old Testament that we're looking at. But it's very important that we start at the beginning, and Jesus Christ is part of that beginning. He's the author of our entire faith. We've been learning throughout this series so far that there are 5 movements of what we call the Old Testament, where God moves his people through a creative process, making us in his image. He makes us to live in community, a relationship with each other. There are laws and rules that define how to live in that community well, how to live with your Creator well. And you know the story that the crisis where Adam and Eve ate of the knowledge of the tree of good and evil creates a crisis for God's people, for all of us that we go through. So God has to lead us through that correction to get us to the cure. God does, in fact, want to heal us and make us well, but that corrective process requires the prophets. Do you remember that we started this series in Hebrews chapter 1, verse 1, where it records that in the past, God spoke to our forefathers through the prophets. You see, God has been speaking throughout this narrative, this timeline of the people of Israel. He's been speaking through the prophets of what? Speaking through the prophets of Jesus, the cure, who, verse 2, in these last days, God has spoken to us by his Son, Jesus, whom he appointed heir of all things and through whom he made the universe. Now, friends, I know this feels like a bit of review, and it is, right? That if we're going to understand God, if we want to know God, we have to understand the creative process and creative nature of Jesus Christ. So this week, as we're on character number 2 of 45 that we'll be looking at throughout the Old Testament, character number 2 is, in fact, Jesus. We saw last week as we looked at the Creator himself, God, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, let us make man in our image, let us being the creative power of that Trinity. And we did spend some time on Jesus, who is this author of our faith. We've read Colossians chapter 1, where it says in verse 15 that he is the image of the invisible God. Jesus is, in fact, who God is. He's the precise image of God's nature. He is, latter part of verse 15, the firstborn over all creation. For by him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible. Okay, so this isn't new information. But here's the thought, friends, and I'd love for you to lean into this a little bit with the Lord this morning. Jesus being our creator, that through him everything was made. Why? Why would God make the world through Jesus? Well, it's because he's an author. That's what jumped off the page at me. He is an author. And every author who's ever written a book, myself included, all the writing I do for you guys, it all starts with an idea. If Jesus is the author and the finisher of our faith, he's the beginning and he's the end. He's the Alpha and Omega, the A and the Z in our English parlance, Alpha being the first character in the Greek language, Omega the last in the Greek language. He's the beginning and the end. He is the author, perfecter, he was God's original idea for creation. Did you catch that? Oh, friends, this is what leaps off the page at me, and I think it's so powerful. That when an author starts with an idea, the whole book or the whole writing flows from one initial concept that then an author begins to flesh out even fuller. When God was creating you and me, when he said, let us make man in our image, when he was creating us, his first thought, his first impulse wasn't you, it wasn't me, it was Jesus. The pre-eternal concept God had for us was salvation. That was his reflex reaction. Let us create. Let's create salvation. We're going to discover this week, friends, that Jesus' presence in the Old Testament is not a plan B reaction to a crisis. It was plan A from the beginning. So would you do this? Could you give God 6 more minutes as we start this week? And could you just slow down and thank God for your salvation, but contemplate that the whole concept of saving us through the cross of Jesus, that was the entire goal of this creation. Can you give God 6 more minutes? Pray about that. Ask the Lord to examine your heart. And then coming back tomorrow, we're going to pick up this character, start seeing Jesus throughout the Old Testament right here on the Daily Six.